Hello, and welcome to Resistance Rangers on the Air, your one-stop shop for all things celebrating public lands and resisting fascism. Who are the Resistance Rangers? We are a community of off-duty anonymous park rangers rallying to save your public lands. I'm your host Cheyenne, and today we're joined by Aaron Murphy from the American Hunters and Anglers Action Network, or AHA for short. They are a nonpartisan organization fiercely dedicated to protecting public lands, hunting, and fishing access. We'll also be featuring short clips from the hunters and fishers whose voices are essential to this conversation.
You're listening to Resistance Rangers on the Air. This podcast is produced by Resistance Rangers, a grassroots volunteer collective. The views expressed here are those of the host and guests who may or may not be current employees, speaking solely in their personal capacities. For any hosts and guests who may or may not be current employees, this is not a part of any official duties. We are not affiliated with the National Park Service, the Department of the Interior, or any other government agency. Nothing said on this podcast should be interpreted as official policy, guidance, or endorsement.
Aaron, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Cheyenne. It's good to be here.
It's nice that you're here, and we're very grateful that you are able to come on and talk with us today.
Easy. Yeah, I'm happy to do it, and I respect what you guys are doing.
So I think something I wanted to start out with was, for our listeners who might not be familiar with American Hunters and Anglers, could you briefly explain who you are and what your mission stands for?
Yeah, absolutely. So American Hunters and Anglers, we like to be called AHA for short. We are a 501c4 organization. That's a little different than a 501c3, and what it does is give us a little more flexibility. 501c3 tend to not be able to say exactly what they need to say just because they fear that they can't be overly political. As a 501c4 organization, we don't have that issue. So we can be a lot more political. It's more of a challenge for us for fundraising, but that's okay. So what we do, we are a small organization. All of us have a lot of experience in public lands policy and politics and hunting and angling. We all happen to live in the state of Montana, but to be very clear, we are a national organization. So we care about public lands, wildlife, clean water, access to all of those things in all 50 states. That is important to us. And so what we do, we exist specifically to influence and engage the political landscape in America, which, as we all know, is very apathetic, right? Most people you talk to say, oh, I hate politics. I have no idea what's going on and I don't care to. Well, that's what we reject. It's a problem. It's an issue. And so what we're trying to do is communicate directly with the people who may not wake up and read Politico or the New York Times every day to figure out what's going on, but they care deeply about the traditions that come with living outdoors and outdoor traditions like hunting and fishing, or if you don't hunt or fish, even taking your kids out for a hike in the mountains. Or if you don't do any of those things, maybe your thing is you live for the weekend where you can take your boat to your local reservoir and drop a worm in the water with a beer in your hand. That is enjoying public lands too. And so we care about all of those things. And all of those things are under direct attack right now. Our slogan is, we are the front line in the war on public lands and wildlife. It is a war. It is a war that is very calculated. There are people in Congress right now who are actively trying to divest, dismantle, and defund our public lands. And so we are fighting that war, and we're fighting it with the best tools we can, which in this day and age, frankly, is social media. And as a 501c4 organization, what we do and what we're very proud of doing is getting our hands dirty with that, right? We have no qualms about calling names or being very tough with our messaging, calling out lawmakers who owe it to us. I think a lot of politicians these days think they work for themselves. No. They work for us. And even U.S. senators who live in other states, for example, Senator Mike Lee, the senior senator from Utah, he might say, well, I only answer to the people of Utah. That's fair. I used to work for a U.S. Senator. I get how that works. But you know what? Mike Lee is the chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So he determines policy for all public lands in this country and waters. And he is actively trying to sell them off. So I don't care where Mike Lee is from, what he does, and the people he tries to convince to vote his way. That affects every single person in this country. So we are a feisty organization. We are loud. We are trying to build a pretty oversized presence on Instagram and TikTok, where I think most people get their political information these days. And just as importantly, we also, this is very serious. We take it seriously, but we also understand that people are looking for information in a way that just doesn't, be a downer, right? So we try to be fun, we try to be reverent, we try to be silly at times, but cutting through all of that is a really important message, which your public lands are under attack. You can do something about it, and you better if you care about things like hunting, fishing, or even taking pictures or exploring a new trail or fishing in a boat on the weekend.
You are fighting a very big war right now, and I feel like you definitely have to be loud and bold and brave in today's climate to be able to get the attention that's needed.
And that's what it takes. And so, for example, yesterday, this is recording, so early September, we sent a letter to Senator Lee, and we basically said, hey, welcome back to the Senate. You have a big job to do. The Senate's job right now is to figure out how to fund the federal government for fiscal year 2026. They're way behind on it, and in this process, there's a chance that public land, access to public lands and water are going to come under attack all over again. So we sent him a letter and say, hey, buddy, if you are going to do what you did last June, which is try to sell 3.3 million acres of public forest service and public BLM land, we are going to do exactly what we did back then, which was activate everybody we know on our circle, make sure they understand exactly who's doing this, and call you out under the carpet. That happened in June, and guess what? He pulled that language from the big, beautiful bill. That's not my word for it. That's the actual name of the bill. He pulled the language because he says he listened to hunters. Well, we don't buy that, because in politics, the only thing that matters is your record, and I don't care what you try to say to make your constituents happy for the moment. If your record doesn't reflect that, we're going to call you out under the carpet. So we did that yesterday. And not only that, we did it by pointing out that Mike Lee just got back from a taxpayer-funded vacation after voting for a bill. He thinks he's a fiscal hawk. BS. The guy just voted for a bill that put America $3 trillion more in deficit. Why? So he could give tax breaks to billionaires and cut the hell out of public lands and waters. So we said, hey, you're basically a hypocrite. And by the way, while you were on your taxpayer-funded vacation, one, we didn't do anything on your social media accounts about you enjoying the public lands that you are charged with overseeing and funding. And two, you spent all your time on social media fighting your culture war. So he tweeted a whole bunch of times about the Cracker Barrel logo. Fine, I guess, but dude, your state, the state of Utah, has 5 national parks and 4 Cracker Barrels. Pay attention to the priorities. We don't think he cares. In fact, we know he doesn't care. And so our job now is to tell the people of Utah and everybody else, hey, this bozo who's in charge of your public lands doesn't care about them. And so if we can get enough volume around that and enough people weighing in and caring about what they can do, which is ultimately hold them accountable and ultimately out of office, then I think we're going to be on the winning track.
So you mentioned the selling of public lands and how terrible that could actually be, particularly the selling of millions of acres of land.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about why that's negative? Why should the average American who may not even use public lands or who may not go to park, like National Park Service lands or to Fish and Wildlife Service lands, like why should they care about that? Why should that matter?
It's a great question, because I think, especially if you, like me, live in Montana and you grow up in public lands and around public lands, why would somebody in, say, I don't know, downtown New York City care? have a great reason to care. But first, let me talk about how important public lands are. Look, in America, we have 640 million acres of public lands. For centuries in Europe and elsewhere, public lands were for kings. They were for the wealthy. They were only for the people who had noble titles to access that land and feed themselves. Well, everybody else had to either get permission or were locked out of them. America's best idea, from people who have thought long and hard about this and fought really valiant fights in the past, realize that in America, you don't have to be royalty in order to access public lands. You simply have to be a citizen, and you are entitled to go out there and enjoy them. You are entitled to harvest food from them. You are entitled to understand what they can do for your soul and your spirit and your emotional health, your physical health. We understand that entire families have memories that center around hunting camp or fishing weekends. All of those things are free in this country. It is our birthright. It is our heritage. Now, if you live in New York City and you never step foot in public lands and don't care to ever visit Yellowstone, fine. You know what else public lands do? They protect your clean water, right? So imagine every single river in this country basically starts at a mountaintop. Many of those mountaintops are publicly owned places, right? Hard to get to, but the last thing you want to do is have some corporation owning a watershed, because that water flows downhill. So if you're in New York City, which by the way has access to wonderful water through public watersheds, you should care for that very reason. Another reason you ought to care is the air you breathe, right? So our national forests are carbon sinks, right? They suck up all that carbon. Clearly we need more of it, but if you take clean air for granted, you shouldn't, because it's public land that keeps that air clean, and frankly, it's our way out of a hole when we care about climate change, which we must.
I think that there is a common conversation in the media right now that park lands and just public lands in general are only important to just visitor usage. But parklands have layers of significance. So for me, I used to work with tribal nations and with other people who are considered traditionally associated to parklands. And they are people who their ancestors lived on this land before it ever became a national park unit. It could be the original owners, which are Native Americans. It could have been people who were enslaved on plantations on parklands. Right. Or it could be just anybody who the Park Service used eminent domain and they took their lands away to build this park. And I think that what people don't realize is those people still continue to interact with these lands today. And for many people, these are the only places they can go back to because they are public lands and still interact with those environments that used to be where their ancestors lived. Right. So they can have, like you mentioned, a spiritual connection. They can have, there are several tribal nations who depend on these lands for treaty rights, for subsistence. There are just so many layers that kind of speak to the significance of park lands other than just a visitor going to learn about the history, which that in itself is very important. But there's just so much happening there when it comes to significance that I feel like most people don't know about or don't understand.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And something happened this week that will help color what you just said. And that is on Wednesday, this would be September 3rd, the U.S. House of Representatives voted on a bill to proceed with the Ambler Access Project. That's also known as the Ambler Road in the Brooks Range of northern Alaska. We're talking a mountain range that's enormous, right? It goes for hundreds of miles. And it is in the middle of, I don't want to say nowhere, it's in the middle of wilderness and pristine, untouched wilderness. What the Ambler Road would do is basically punch a 211-mile road through the Brooks Range in order for developers to access a copper and a zinc mine. This road, as the New York Times reports, would cross 11 rivers, thousands of streams, and all for mineral extraction. Well, look, if you hunt, deer in Wisconsin, you probably dream of hunting caribou in the Brooks Range of Alaska. You may never go there, but you know that that place is an important habitat. And even if it's not this widely visited area, there is something intrinsically important about making sure that places where our wild animals live, and even if you can access it, you may not be able to drive a road to it, but if you can hike yourself into there, there's something special about keeping the land the way God created it, right? So I think people recognize that, they realize that, and so then the question becomes, well, what is the value of public lands? People like Senator Mike Lee say, well, it's however much we can sell it for. We say it is priceless. You cannot put a price on open, wild land where wildlife run free, where clean water begins, and where our air is purified. And by the way, we're talking entire ecosystems. And I think if we can take a step back, realize that public land doesn't exist for us to harvest and extract from. It is there to sustain us. We are trying to make sure people are aware of. In the rough and tumble world of politics, where people just care about bulldozing and mining and drilling, we're here to say, wait a second, people go into these lands to harvest food for their families. We can't screw around with that.
No, you can't. I am from the South and from a rural area in the South, which means I have several family who live very low income lifestyles. And if it weren't from having access to public lands and the ability to hunt and fish, there would be no way for them to be able to put food on the table for their family.
Right.
It is a subsistence.
It's a big deal. And again, I grew up in Wyoming. I live in Montana. And, most everybody I know plans their year around that time in the fall when they fill their freezer for the year. And by the way, other than the cost of the permit and the ammunition and, processing the meat afterwards, it's free. And it is open to anybody. So that it's a really good point. It's not just about, going out for fun and shooting an animal for fun. No, it's about respecting the wildlife and being sustained from it and understanding that in this country, again, you don't have to be a king to do that. It's a big deal. And we're flirting with the idea of taking that all away and giving it back to the kings, the wealthy of this country. Come on, we got to wake up. We got to do something about it. And right now we live in a democracy, for now, where you still can.
You mentioned the idea of respecting the wildlife, and I know that there is this common misconception or stereotype surrounding hunters and fishers where there is this idea that they're all conservative and they don't care for the environment. Could you talk a bit about this misconception and really explain the role that hunters and fishers actually play in environmental conservation, which is a huge role?
Oh, yeah, it's huge. And in fact, especially in a place like in the western states like Montana, it's essential. And I would forcefully push back against anybody who says people who hunt or fish are not good stewards of the land. Of course, they're bad apples in every bunch. Most of them, though, follow the fair chase ethic, right? The North American wildlife management model, where, again, the wildlife are public, and the responsibility that comes with that is making sure that we manage it properly and that you eat what you harvest, right? You don't shoot for sport. I mean, there's sport shooting exists. And again, I don't want to take away from that tradition if that's your thing, but what we're talking about is game harvesting, right? Whether it's a Rocky Mountain elk in Montana or, smaller critters in the South or fish from the reservoir or caribou in Alaska, all of those things. And again, that's not an elitist thing at all. As you said, it is a source of food for a lot of people who generally tend to understand exactly what's going on. They know darn well that you can't just give a license to everybody and kill all the animals and leave them to rot. Like, that's not sustainable. And if you're a hunter and if you are raised as a proper hunter, you know that darn well. And so what we're trying to do is piece that ethic together with the current political moment and saying, wait a second, these two things aren't aligning, right? So if you care about that thing, then the party that you may have voted for in Congress is working against that thing. Again, I don't think there's anything devious about what the people did when they voted. They just simply didn't know, for all sorts of reasons we can get into later. But again, I think the bottom line is, in this country, we have an apathetic political landscape where people just don't want to know or care about what their elected leaders are doing. And guess what? That's going to bite you in the butt in more ways than one. But especially if you're a hunter and angler and your access is being taken away, or some rich Silicon Valley billionaire is going to go and buy up the land where you've taken your family hunting for generations, all of a sudden you're going to start to care. And our goal is to make sure that you don't start caring after it's too late.
So the president recently signed the Make America Beautiful Again executive order. And this EO, it establishes the president's Make America Beautiful Again Commission with stated goals like promoting stewardship, expanding access, and recovering fish and wildlife. Yeah. I know that it's wrapped up in this big, beautiful bow, but underneath the box, there's actually a lot of very hidden negative impacts in there. And one of those is the streamlining processes of encouraging voluntary conservation, which might sound great to some people. It actually can have really negative impacts on wildlife, particularly for those who are the bad apples, who are going to overhunt and overfish. Can you talk a little bit about how voluntary conservation could end up really negatively impacting public lands and the wildlife and the environment in general?
Yeah, happy to. Great question. And also, let's talk a little bit first about this executive order, which, like you said, it sounds great on paper, right? Nobody's against opposing national parks, blah, 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 on paper. The problem with it is this administration I see it as a form of propaganda, right? Hey, as we actively screw public lands, we're going to put out this flowery thing about how much we care about public lands, even though in reality, we're not doing much about it. In fact, we're actively hurting it. You look at what happened with Elon Musk and Doge, and by the way, I think the administration realizes that was a disaster. It didn't cut anything. 1, 2, it gutted the workforce. 3, it screwed public land and our national parks and our national forests, and we're still struggling with that today. And then Elon Musk just disappeared and we pretend it never happened. No, that guy is to blame. And so is the president of the United States and everybody around him who said, oh, this is a great idea to just cut everything that has been working pretty well. Of course we can make it more efficient. Of course we can eliminate waste. But going through with an axe instead of a scalpel to basically say, if you have dedicated your life as a public servant to being a steward of public lands, being a scientist, you don't do it because it pays well. You do it because you care and you care about the future. All of a sudden, those people got wiped out. And so we're making sure people don't forget that. Just because we don't talk about Elon Musk every day in the media doesn't mean we should forget the wealthiest person to have ever lived on this planet probably fired you. That's terrible optics, much less terrible policy. Regarding the voluntary conservation, we should all pitch in to care for these things. Of course we should. Of course we should. The problem is what you're doing is you're basically saying, look, we're going to get rid of the professional people who are there to maintain, say, a national park. I used to be a ranger in Yellowstone, so I know exactly what's going on, right? Yellowstone just doesn't operate because it operates. No, it operates because of a force of Park Service staff who care deeply about running that place and keeping it the way that it was intended as soon as it was formed in 1972, right? That means getting rid of trash. It means law enforcement. It means tracking all the bears. It means making sure that the fish are healthy. It means making sure that visitors have a good experience, that they learn, that they don't have to wait 10 hours to get into the national park once they're there. All of those things aren't free. I would argue they aren't very expensive, but they aren't free. And you can't just replace that by calling on people to say, well, maybe we should just volunteer. You know, people need guidance. They need the pros who are there, who know what they're doing, to basically not do all of the work, but to cut the whole system so that we aren't stuck with relying on a core of volunteers to keep a national park like Yellowstone or even lesser national parks, smaller national parks operating. So I don't think it's a really good idea to basically say, look, I care about public land, so I'm going to sign this executive order and basically just forget about it. Meantime, I just read this the other day. The New York Times reported this, but in Zion National Park, that park has lost at least $2 million so far this year from lost revenue. Why? Because they don't have enough rangers to take the entrance fees. That's what I did in Yellowstone, and they don't have enough money to take money. That's insane. So Elon Musk may have saved a few $1 million, but guess what? He's also cost a place like Zion at least $2 million in the process. And of course, it's screwing up, as we were talking about earlier, the firefighting efforts, the science efforts, the law enforcement, the visitor experience. All of those things are hurt by what happened with Elon Musk and Doge, and no executive order, no matter how beautiful it is going to gut for that.
I really appreciate you bringing up the importance of staff on public land staff. As someone who was terminated in February, it is still something that's extremely emotional for many of us. Those of us who were brought back very quickly. And it was after weeks of sitting around wondering about our jobs and our life and what happens next. It was many of us signed leases. Many of us had to leave and move away from where we were at to go back to our homes, which, for the listeners who may not understand, a lot of federal workers, not just Park Service workers, but Fish and Wildlife Service workers, Forest Service workers, we all take jobs in places that are in very remote places for the most part. And we do have to sacrifice and move away from our families and our homes and live in places that aren't cheap to live at. They're not cheap rent-wise. They're not cheap grocery-wise. And if you have a child, daycares are very expensive. It's not an easy choice, and we're often not paid very well because we don't go into it for the pay. We go into it because we're passionate about protecting public lands and access to public lands and the resources at these places. So I really appreciate you bringing it up. It's not being talked about in the media that much anymore, and no one's really understanding the negative impacts that you are seeing today across the parks from, we had closed visitor centers at one point. You have, in U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, you have understaffed wildlife refuges. They manage millions of acres of land, and they're operating with maybe a handful of people. There are fish hatcheries, which, if you don't know what a fish hatchery is, they produce fish and put them out in the waters for people to actually go out there and fish. And they also help care for endangered species. And you have some that are down to 2, or you have some that lost all of their staff altogether, and I think it's in Wyoming, they're shutting down a 100-year-old fish hatchery because there's just no staff to manage that. And that is hugely impactful.
Oh, it's huge. Right.
Hugely to the environment, but also to the economy, because fishing and hunting bring in a lot of money to the economy.
Oh, actually, let's put the number on it, because this was in the executive order. It's important to note, and it's a number that I don't think you can ever ignore, no matter what party you belong to. But hunting, fishing, visiting a national park, all of the things we're talking about contribute to a $1.2 trillion outdoor recreation economy. $1.2 trillion. That is a lot of money. And by the way, that doesn't even count the jobs that come with it too, right? So in a lot of places, we're talking about fish hatcheries. People don't probably think about fish hatcheries every day unless you're a really avid fisherman. But, the jobs that also come with selling the flies at the fly shop and, fixing the boats and the hotels and restaurants and all of the things that come with public lands. I don't think this administration is paying attention to not only the intrinsic value, but the economic value, which is massive.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to see in a few years how economically this has impacted some of the gateway communities around parks and refuges and other public lands.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Cody, Wyoming, which is a gateway community to Yellowstone. And let me tell you, when people have to wait in long lines, they get really grumpy. And they also get grumpy about paying the entrance fee. Well, the entrance fee is a small little price to pay. And actually, that brings me to one thing I would say is, in this executive order, there was a suggestion that, people who aren't Americans pay higher entrance fees. Again, I understand that, but I think that's missing the forest through the trees, right? So the issue isn't collecting more from the German tourists. The issue is you can't make up for what you cut simply by jacking up the entrance fee on a segment of people by a few bucks, right? We are talking a system that relies on taxpayer support from everywhere, that pays relatively little for what, Ken Burns calls, and we should all agree, is America's best idea, right? The national park system, much less other things like the Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM lands, the Forest Service itself. The Forest Service, as you know, a little different because it's under the Department of Agriculture. The forests are where we do, from time to time, say, hey, this part of the forest has resources that we should extract from it. Or, there's opportunities here. It's okay to cut these trees down if there's a ski area there, for example. But all of it is designed to be part of an ecosystem of balance. And right now, we are way off balance. And why? It's because there was a decision at the beginning of this year to basically not just cut things, but to cut through the bone of things. And now we're paying the price for that. And I think if you're a Joe Blow citizen who was looking forward to going to Zion National Park this year, and you had to wait a long time to get in, and it was crowded, and bathrooms were overflowing, and garbage was piling up, that stuff is real. It's happening. So now your taxpayer money went to the parks, and guess what? You got nothing for it. Shame on us if we allow that to happen.
Yes, shame on us if we allow that. This has been an incredibly insightful and sobering and just overall scary conversation to think about what's happening. For our listeners who are maybe feeling like they want to do something about it, who are passionate about public land, who just listen to this and they feel a little overwhelmed about what's happening and would like to do something impactful, what can they do right now to make a difference?
Oh, such a great question. I'm so glad you asked it, because the last thing we want to do is make people feel like they don't have a say in this. You do. And if you don't think we do, then you're forfeiting your democratic sovereignty to people who care about bulldozing it all. So if you do care, here's what you do. You contact your representatives in Congress. Now, I have a tip for that. I used to be a chief of staff to a United States senator, and so I used to be the guy who took all of this stuff in and reported to the senator himself on what happened. Right now, I think, the first instinct, I think the old paradigm was to call up your senators or maybe send them an email. That's fine. That works, kind of. I think what's more effective now, though, is to take that fight to social media. That is where America is getting its political information. Guess what? All members of Congress and their staffs read what's online, and they read the comments. So if you care, what I would do is go and find your lawmaker on Facebook, Instagram. If they're on TikTok. If they're on Blue Sky, find them there. If they're on Twitter, find them there. And tag them. Make sure that their staff can see what's tagged and make a stink. That actually works. And it may not work only because the bonehead that you're trying to reach doesn't listen to constituents. So then what you do is, if you live in a specific state, you better vote. I know that sounds very basic to some people, but man, it's surprising to me how many people tell me, well, I don't vote because my vote doesn't matter. Well, it doesn't matter because you didn't vote. That's the only way that your vote doesn't matter, is if you don't vote. So go vote. Make sure that you're informed about it. It's not hard. In fact, it's critically important, especially if you care about the future of this country. And then the last thing I would say is show up, right? Politics is a blood sport, and it is determined by the people who show up to the game. So, for example, if you know of a protest at a certain national park is happening, or a day of action on something, be noisy about it. I remember in Santa Fe, New Mexico, earlier this summer, the Western Governors Association was meeting at a hotel. Outside this hotel, Interior Secretary Burgum, he oversees the Park Service. A whole bunch of people showed up, and they were pissed, and rightly so. They were pissed that the Park Service and other public lands were getting screwed by Doug Burgum, and they came with signs, they yelled, they made things uncomfortable, they dominated the headlines. Guess what? That wouldn't have happened if people didn't show up. And the more, frankly, the merrier. So those are three things that you can do. Whatever you do, my advice would be to not think, well, my vote doesn't matter. I guess I'm just going to have to live with the consequences. No. That's what you do if you lose and you lose to a dictatorship. And we're on that track, I fear. So let's make sure that it doesn't happen. Don't lose your voice. Most important thing you can do. Resist with the Resistance Rangers and educate yourself and find good information. There's plenty of it out there, and there's a lot of bad information too. And I think your challenge as a citizen of this country is to determine the two and act on it.
And thank you so much for your advice just then and for coming on the show today. Your insights were very invaluable.
Yeah, well, appreciate what you guys do, and thank you for your service. And I'm sorry it got disrupted by a bozo who builds rockets for a living, but keep up the really good work. We are behind you all the way, and look forward to working very closely with you guys in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Up next, we will hear from some anonymous individuals about why fishing and hunting and having access to public lands is so important for them for a variety of reasons that range from having connections to loved ones who have passed on, for their mental health, and for conservation and their abilities to be stewards of the lands, and just so much more.
My father died before I could ever know him. All I had were a few photographs and stories about his love for the outdoors, especially fishing. For years, I felt this void, always searching for a piece of him. I found it when I picked up a rod and walked onto a national wildlife refuge. Casting a line on those public waters isn't just a hobby, it's the closest I'll ever get to sharing an experience with him. Every river bend, every quiet morning on a lake, it feels like a conversation. Public land is essential because it guarantees a place for personal pilgrimage. It's where I can go free of charge and free of complication to find that unbroken connection to the man I never met. It's my inheritance, and it's protected for me and everyone else who needs that space for memory.
I grew up in the city, but my grandpa was a fishing guide up north, and he'd take me to a national forester park every summer. That's where I learned to cast a line and learned a lot about patience. I believe that public streams are like shared classrooms. They're the reason a kid like me from the city ever got a chance to know what a wild trout looks like. If those lands weren't protected and accessible to everyone, that part of my life, that connection to my grandpa, it just wouldn't exist.
My grandmother moved north from Mississippi, but she never lost her touch with the land. She didn't hunt, but she taught me to fish and to forage. She used to say, "Public land ain't just land, it's a grocery store you pay taxes on." For us, it was about subsistence, trout from the state creeks, mushrooms, and wild greens from the national forest woods. We weren't wealthy, so this wasn't a hobby. It was putting food on the table. But it's more than that. Standing by the water, feeling the cool earth, it connects me back to a history that's often pushed aside, a deep, resilient knowledge of nature. These public spaces are vital because they are the last few places where that traditional knowledge can still be practiced and passed down, where a young Black person like myself can feel a connection to the land and to my ancestors. It's where I'd go to heal from the past and to find peace.
As a veteran, I struggle with finding quiet places that make me feel safe. The noise of everyday life can be too much, but when I step onto a national park trail or launch my little boat on a public lake, it's like the world just slows down. I can be alone with my thoughts and the rhythm of the water. Public lands are essential for my PTSD, for my overall mental health. They keep my depression at bay and keep me alive.
Hunting on public land is about proving yourself against the wilderness. It's not easy, which is why it's so rewarding, but it also comes with a deep sense of ownership. Since it's our land, I feel a direct responsibility to be a steward. I participate in trail cleanups and habitat restoration because when you've earned a deer on that public ground, you feel a personal investment in protecting it for all the other hunters, hikers, and future generations.
That wraps up today's conversation with Aaron Murphy from the American Hunters and Anglers Action Network. We thank him for his insights into protecting our public lands. And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Resistance Rangers on the Air, where we collect breaking news and stories from the front lines of the resistance. We fact check and filter everything through the lens of our experiences with public lands. You may not know that there are laws, rules, and traditions that have long prevented rangers and other civil servants from speaking out. Through our collective anonymity, we speak for those who can't. For more info, check out our website and socials linked in the show notes. And remember to leave no trace and ranger on. Please note that any views or opinions expressed in this program are solely those of the host and do not represent those of the National Park Service or Department of the Interior.